So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all for our first seminar in our new lecture series on resource struggles and international law. I'm Julia Dem.
And I'm Caitlin Murphy, and we're really delighted to see so much interest in these questions. So before introducing our speaker, we just like to recognise that although we're meeting on the somewhat placeless Zoom, that we're all physically somewhere, and we want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, and that their land was stolen and that sovereignty has never been ceded. I want to pay respect to elders past and present.
So this online lecture series on resource struggles and international law seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historical discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. It explores how international law is used by different actors to assert their authority and power over resources and to secure access to natural resources both in and beyond areas of national jurisdiction. Our hope is that by better understanding how international law has enabled and promoted unsustainable and inequitable resource extraction, we can better navigate the current transition to a low carbon world and collectively build futures that are more ecologically and socially just. We're delighted to have such a wonderful lineup of speakers for our first semester, as well as Dr. Cait Storr, who'll be speaking to us today. We'll also have lectures by Dr. George Forgiamin, Professor Sigrid Boyson, Dr. Laios Kulamadale, Dr. Fergus Green, and Professor Umut Ozul. If you haven't yet registered for the other lectures in the series, please do make sure you do. Additionally, Dr. Anna Saunders and I will be convening a reading group on the theme of making and unmaking natural resources. So please do also stay tuned for further details about that reading group.
And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Cait Storr, who's a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School. She researches the law, history, and politics of property, territory, and jurisdiction, with a focus on struggles for control over natural resources. She's published on the history of international administration, the concept of territory in international law, imperialism in the Pacific, decolonization, environmental law, and on property and concepts of the commons. Her doctoral thesis was awarded the Melbourne Law School Prize for Best Doctoral Thesis and the University of Melbourne Chancellor's Prize, and is published as a monograph, International Status in the Shadow of Empire, Nauru and Histories of International Law, at Cambridge University Press in 2020. So Cait's research is informed by her professional experience working in government and private practice. She's a qualified legal practitioner with experience at major law firms in resource projects, environmental planning, and corporate governance, and has also worked for a legal consultant for the United Nations Development Programme. And we're really excited to hear from her today. So she'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Over to you, Cait.
Thank you so much, Caitlin and Julia, for having me in this wonderful series. I'll also acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to elders past and present. My talk is called The Third Wave of Critical Minerals, and I'll get into it. For the third time in a century, the concept of critical minerals has become a central theme in international trade and security discourse. Minerals criticality first arose as a theme in US defense and foreign policy circles in the 1930s and 40s. It returned to prominence from the mid-1970s through to mid-1980s in the wake of the 1970s oil crises. In the post-pandemic era, the concept of minerals criticality has become all but ubiquitous in international debates concerning the global energy transition on the one hand and geopolitical instability on the other. In this paper, I examine the evolution of critical minerals discourse over these three waves. I do so in order to identify, first, the context in which the concept has tended to emerge, and secondly, to examine the politics of critical minerals discourse in this third wave. I argue first that in each wave, critical minerals discourse has emerged in response to geopolitical instability understood by the US to threaten its military and economic hegemony. Such threats to US hegemony have routinely been framed as threats to both national and international security. And it is the construction of security that, at any given point in time, has defined the scope of minerals criticality. Drawing from critical security studies, the article observes further that the construction of security that defines the scope of criticality has expanded significantly over the last century. As a result, the field of extractive activity susceptible to securitization, and thus designation as critical, has also expanded to encompass the downstream supply chains of a growing field of end users, from EV production to military technology to AI infrastructure. However, whilst criticality claims have expanded to include matters of general competitive advantage, the concept of minerals criticality has not shared its origins in US defence policy. As such, while the third wave of critical minerals policies have routinely been justified by reference to the global energy transition, there is no necessary connection between minerals criticality and action on climate change. A given critical minerals list is just as likely to be defined by reference to pursuing competitive advantage in global digital and military technology sectors, or to strengthening geopolitical alliances, as to decarbonisation of the global energy economy. Given this increasingly diffuse scope, criticality claims may seem to have dissolved into meaninglessness. However, the second argument I'll make is that, notwithstanding the expanding scope of national security by which it is defined, critical minerals discourse in its third wave has, at least until about a month ago, had a clear politics in which a number of major themes can be identified. In the first three parts of the paper, I'll sketch the contours of the first, second, and third waves. In the fourth part, I'll examine the politics of critical minerals discourse in this third wave to date and identify what I see to be the major functions and interests it serves. I'll then conclude that critical minerals discourse could just as readily serve the second Trump administration's zero-sum fascist version of US hegemony as it did the Biden administration's green industrial version. So, the first wave. Critical minerals discourse first arose at the intersection of US defence and industrial policy in the later 1930s. However, it's important to understand that criticality claims have their origin in what had previously been understood as the raw materials problem. In 1920, the newly formed Council of the League of Nations directed its Economic and Financial Committee to report on, to quote, the difficulties experienced by numerous countries in assuring the import of raw materials essential to their welfare and security. The inquiry was framed as an empirical one, but that masked the normative question it begged. Given the unequal geographical distribution of the natural resources required to industrialise, which norms should govern international trade in those resources? The committee framed the problem as one of rule and exception. On the one hand was the incontestable proposition that, to quote, raw materials produced by one country, being in many cases essential to the economic life of other states, should not, unless in exceptional circumstances, be the object of restrictions of such a nature as to injure the production of such states. Rule. On the other, state sovereignty necessarily included the power to subject domestic natural resources to a regime in conformity with their natural economy, and states had, by virtue of sovereignty, the incontestable right, in exceptional circumstances, to reserve their natural resources to themselves. The raw materials problem was thus framed as one of defining the scope of permissible exceptions to the ideal of universal free trade. Over the 1920s, the League powers' framing of the raw materials problem as a question of trade policy and not of unequal territorial distribution was increasingly challenged by Germany, Italy, and Japan. Whereas the League powers proffered open-door trade in their colonial and imperial territories as the solution, the Axis powers demanded adjustment of the World War I territorial settlement in their favour. It was in this volatile geopolitical context that the concept of strategic and critical materials first emerged. As the interwar territorial settlement disintegrated, it became common practice in US defense circles to designate certain materials as strategic or critical on national security grounds. The purpose of listing a material was to authorize the appropriation of public funds for state intervention in that market in anticipation of supply chain disruption in the event of war. Initial proposals for market intervention on security grounds went no further than the establishment of stockpiles of listed materials from foreign sources. Within a few years, however, largely as a result of lobbying by the US mining industry, critical materials proposals included state subsidisation of the private development of the domestic resource base. The US Strategic and Critical Materials Stockpiling Act of 1939, the first piece of legislation to define critical minerals, defined materials as follows: the natural resources of the US in certain strategic and critical materials being deficient to supply the industrial, military, and naval needs of the country for common defence. So there's a defence objective here. It is the purpose and intent of this Act to provide for the acquisition of stocks and to encourage the development of mines and deposits of these materials within the US, and thereby decrease and prevent, wherever possible, a dangerous and costly dependence of the US upon foreign nations for supplies of these materials in times of national emergency. In this first wave, then, US critical materials policy repeatedly emphasised very narrow definitions of security as coexistent with national emergency, if not open declarations of war. And at least until the mid-1940s, critical minerals policies focused on domestic modes of intervention. From the early 1950s, however, US critical materials policy expanded to include securing reliable transnational supply chains with allies in anticipation of future conflicts. From the 1950s, which is important to recall right now, resource policy debates in the US converged around the view that even in times of open war, resource independence through strict economic nationalism was not only practically impossible, but strategically undesirable. In 1951, President Truman established the Materials Policy Commission, which issued its first report, known as the Paley Report, in 1952. The report revived the language of the raw materials problem and began from the presumption that resource independence was the wrong objective for US trade and security policy, not least because US consumption was fast outpacing domestic production capacity. The report concluded that the aim of critical minerals policy should not be to decrease economic interdependence or reliance on foreign suppliers per se, but rather to strengthen the ideological bases of economic interdependence between the US and its allies around US values of economic growth, private enterprise, and anti-communism. The Paley Report was thus a comprehensive working through in resources policy of what were to become the ideological objectives of US aid and development policy throughout the Cold War. On to the second wave. Critical minerals discourse subsided over the 2 decades following the Korean War, a period of US ascendancy in which mineral prices remained largely stable and global supply steady. Over the 1950s and 1960s, the US government accordingly deprioritised critical minerals policy, and early in 1973, an embattled President Nixon authorised the selling down of national resource stockpiles to fight domestic inflation. Nixon's timing was poor. In October 1973, global resource markets lurched precipitously when OPEC asserted control over world oil prices, and the Organisation of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed oil embargoes on states that supported Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and the Sinai Peninsula. As a result, world oil prices quadrupled, prompting reactive price surges in global markets for zinc, tin, and copper. The 1970s oil crises exposed the US's shift, as the Paley Report had anticipated, from net exporter to net importer of minerals and metals, prompting an about-face in US policy. Critical minerals discourse resurged in trade and foreign policy debates from the mid-1970s through to the mid-1980s, both within the US and its major allies. Perceived threats to US national security during this second wave extended beyond the first wave focus on formal declarations of war or national emergency to include copycat cartel formation in resource markets other than oil, nationalisation of domestic resources by decolonising states, mineral supply chain disruption due to conflict between South Africa and Angola and Namibia, and above all, Soviet manipulation of the dependence of northern economies on resource imports from the decolonising global south. In 1976, at the height of the Cold War, the Ford administration adopted a policy of energy independence. The goal that had for decades been understood by the US government as both practically impossible and strategically undesirable had, in the wake of oil price surges, become wildly popular in domestic politics. Criticality claims in this second wave were defined by reference to an expanded concept of energy security, an expanded view of national security that extended well beyond early definitions of military and essential civilian need during times of war to encompass the general energy needs of the US domestic economy. Critical minerals policies accordingly expanded in the later 1970s to include increased funding for state geological surveying and increased subsidisation of the domestic resources industry in both production and processing. From the mid-1970s, minerals criticality was taken up as an object of study by a new generation of realist international relations scholars. This generation of Cold War realists included Hedley Bull, Kenneth Waltz, Robert Gilpin, and Stephen Krasner, who were centrally concerned with redefining national security in an international order perceived as inherently anarchic. Realist analyses of the international order, and in particular Gilpin and Krasner's development of hegemonic stability theory, were to exercise significant influence on US defence and foreign policy over the late 1970s and 1980s. In 1979, Stephen Krasner concluded that the US was using critical minerals policy to secure general foreign policy objectives, including maximising the competitive advantage of US firms. This second wave was to peak during the Reagan administration, following the release of its Strategic and Critical Non-Fuel Minerals Report in 1983. Echoing the 1952 Paley Report, the 1983 report walked back Ford's populist embrace of energy independence. It instead held that stockpiling and subsidisation of domestic production were effective short-term measures for protecting national security during times of national emergency, but that longer-term strategies were required to mitigate the vulnerabilities created by dependence on imports. The report made a raft of recommendations, including diversifying foreign sources of supply, releasing public lands for resource exploration, and above all, refocusing on foreign policy initiatives, including through international development and aid programs, and direct diplomatic and military intervention in contexts of foreign political instability that could threaten US hegemony. On to the third wave. Critical minerals discourse largely fell dormant from the early 1990s, a period famously of neoliberal ascendancy anchored by US hegemony. The US and its allies regarded the proliferation of multilateral trade agreements in this period, and most crucially, the establishment of the WTO, as mitigating the risk of supply chain disruption due to global economic instability and ideological conflict. As is equally well documented, this period of neoliberal ascendancy began to erode in the wake of the GFC. After 2008, the economic growth of China challenged neoliberal trade and investment orthodoxy, while its Belt and Road investments across the global south steadily built counterweight to US dominance. Critical minerals discourse resurfaced in US trade and security debates and escalated sharply in 2010 following China's imposition of an embargo on the export of rare earth elements to Japan following an incident in disputed waters near the Senkaku Islands. China's embargo of a US ally brought into open view China's strategic dominance of critical minerals supply chains, and specifically of the processing of rare earth elements vital to the manufacture of semiconductors and therefore digital technologies, but also renewable energy infrastructure and EVs. It further signalled China's intention to leverage its dominance toward its own geopolitical ends, which of course had been the prerogative of the United States previously. Over the 2010s, as tensions between China and the US began to unravel post-Cold War norms of multilateral trade, rhetorical distinctions between climate, trade, and security agendas began to break down. The US and its allies moved to adopt broad-based trade and defence policies aimed at containment of China. In this context, critical minerals discourse was taken up, predominantly in the global north, as a justification for alliances, strategies, and policies which sought to counter China's increasing challenge to US hegemony. China-US relations, I'm telling you things you all know very well. China-US relations deteriorated further in the wake of the South China Sea arbitration, hastened by the bellicose anti-China rhetoric of the first Trump administration. As we all know, Trump reframed multilateral trade norms as a bad deal for the US and a threat to the national interest, reviving populist tropes of economic nationalism. In 2020, the third wave of critical minerals discourse became a flood. Amid global supply chain disruptions, the US and its allies released a rash of critical minerals branded trade policies, bilateral and multilateral alliances. Many such policies and alliances were concluded outside the framework of existing multilateral institutions and aligned broadly with the Biden administration's embrace of green industrial policy. Critical minerals discourse, in fact, became a recurrent theme of the Biden administration from 2021, anchored around its flagship Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the IRA, which sought to address domestic inflation by building US manufacturing capacity in renewable energy, digital, and defense infrastructure. At the same time, international institutions, including the World Bank and the OECD, released a rash of empirical reports projecting future demand and supply of critical minerals in the context of the global energy transition. These included the International Energy Agency's widely influential 2021 report, The Role of Critical Minerals in Clean Energy Transitions. Criticality claims in this third wave have thus expanded far beyond their origins in US planning for war, and even beyond second wave concepts of energy security. Critical minerals policies are now packaged by governments across the political spectrum as a panacea for everything, from the climate crisis to domestic unemployment to rising inflation to loss of competitive advantage to geopolitical volatility to military vulnerability and, gallingly, to escalating First Nations and regional inequality. Australia's Future Made in Australia National Interest Framework, released last year, is a prime example. Australia's critical minerals list is currently defined to include, to quote, minerals essential to our modern technologies, economies, and national security, which are in demand from our strategic international partners and vulnerable to supply chain disruption. Dispelling any presumption that minerals criticality is necessarily tied to decarbonisation, Australia's list of critical technologies, which in turn defines the scope of criticality claims, currently includes advanced manufacturing, AI technologies, autonomous systems and robotics, advanced information and communications technologies, and biotechnologies. In this third wave, then, critical minerals discourse has thus far been deployed by governments across the political spectrum towards a sprawling range of ends. Criticality has proven particularly useful for centrist governments, I should say, in liberal democratic states, as a means of responding to electoral pressure from the left to act on climate change and from the right to act on inflation and defence. but it has proven equally useful to right-wing governments advancing populist platforms of improving terms of trade and building defence capacity. Criticality claims in this third wave thus reflect a further expansion, if not collapse, of constructs of national security, in which the distinctions, as I said, between security, trade, industrial, and climate agendas have effectively broken down. This argument applies the insights of security studies from within international relations and more recently within international law to critical minerals discourse. For example, Shirley Scott identified over a decade ago that international climate change discourse was being securitised. Aziz Rana argued again over a decade ago in the context of the US war on terror that the ambit of national security claims are inherently indeterminate, pointing toward an underlying contest over who decides on issues of war and emergency. More recently, Benton Heath has built on these analyses, diagnosing a new construction of national security as, to quote, a growing collection of security practices agnostic to the source or nature of a threat, unbounded by time and space, and decentered from any overriding great power or interstate conflict. For Heath, this new national security demonstrates the ultimate unsustainability of long-held distinctions between ordinary trade and national security, or between rule and exception. Building on Rana, Heath argues that the conceptual uncertainty of contemporary security claims reflect their function as assertions of epistemic authority. Heath concludes that security claims reflect underlying struggles over whose knowledge matters in security policy and how that knowledge is deployed. This conclusion draws on earlier insights of critical security studies, which as a subfield of international relations has sought to analyse, as Browning and MacDonald have put it, the role of representations of security in encouraging sets of policy responses, legitimising the role of particular actors, or indeed constituting political communities in particular ways. These insights into the politics of security apply equally to criticality claims. Critical minerals discourse reflects moves to securitise certain forms of extractive activity and to assert the authority, whether on behalf of the state or otherwise, to decide what forms of extractive activity should be securitised and what exceptional measures securitisation should involve. So, to summarise the discussion so far, over the last century, critical minerals discourse has risen as a major theme in international trade and security debates in three waves. In each wave, critical minerals discourse emerged as a response to geopolitical instability understood by the US and its allies to challenge US hegemony. The concept of minerals criticality is inherently unstable because it is defined by constructions of national security which are themselves both indeterminate and expanding. In this third wave, the concept of minerals criticality has expanded to a degree where distinctions between trade, climate, and security as objects of governance have effectively collapsed. This is not to say, however, that the current wave of critical minerals policies treats the objectives of climate, trade, and security equally, because they do not. To be clear here, there is no dispute that the transition away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energy production requires accelerated mining of key resources and in a dangerously short period if climate change is to be mitigated in any consequential way. Nor is there any dispute that China's dominance of critical mineral supply chains does in fact pose a novel challenge to US hegemony and the system of international trade anchored around it. But the purpose of this article is not to diagnose the current geopolitical moment. It is rather to observe that over the last century, critical minerals discourse has evolved as an effect of attempts to securitise certain forms of extractive activity, and second, to examine the politics of critical minerals discourse in this third wave. So that's what I'm about to do. I'll ask for your patience for about another 5 to 7 minutes. Now, the question of politics is, of course, a highly complex one. The answers necessarily differ by state, by project, and at the moment it seems by the day. However, accepting the risks of oversimplification, four general tendencies can be identified in the politics of critical minerals discourse in this third wave thus far. First, as a response to challenges to US hegemony, critical minerals discourse has served as a vehicle for defining the national security of the US and its allies according to the defense of US hegemony. This is a well-traversed theme in international law and international relations. I don't intend to reprise that literature here. The intention is simply to observe that critical minerals policies have been used by the US and its allies to announce strategic departures from previously dominant neoliberal trade norms and obligations in favour of building trade alliances anchored in ideology, patronage, and military interdependence with the US. This era of recalibrations in international trade and security relations has attracted a rash of diagnoses. You'll be familiar with them, from deglobalization to onshoring to friendshoring to disintegration to de-risking. Many such analyses pronounce entry into a new era of bi or multipolarity. Such pronouncements may prove overstated, they may prove understated. It remains to be seen. What is clear is that in this third wave to date, the climate goals of criticality claims have tended to gain traction only where they coincide with commercial and defence agendas. And as this paper emphasises, criticality claims are a mode of security claim that bear no necessary relation to climate goals. So on to the second tendency. In this third wave, critical minerals discourse has thus far proven an effective vehicle for renegotiating domestic resources policy in favour of extractive industry. In this third wave, mining interests in critical minerals sectors have been very successful in asserting a unity between their own interest in securing competitive advantage in the renewable energy economy and the public interest in securing substantive action on climate change. This is but one dimension of the broader co-optation of the global climate agenda by corporate interests, but its consequences are worth spelling out, particularly in Australia. At present in Australia, the Labor government and the mining sector have realigned around critical minerals discourse after 15 years of conflict over climate policy. Australia's critical mineral strategy is part of its Future Made in Australia policy, which seeks to stimulate domestic production and processing of critical minerals and to rebuild advanced manufacturing capacity in strategic sectors in service of US supply chains. Now, this strategy is a shared policy platform of the Australian government and the Minerals Council of Australia, the peak lobby group of Australian mining companies, which includes BHP and Rio Tinto, the two largest mining companies by market capitalisation in the world. The third wave of critical minerals discourse has thus effectively allowed both the Australian government and Australian extractive industry to rebrand mining as climate action. The Australian government has earmarked over $7 billion of public funding for the mining sector to mine towards net zero, a slogan also used by the Minerals Council of Australia. Again, this is not to deny that the transition away from fossil fuels is existentially urgent or that patterns of global resource supply and production must be reconfigured. It is rather to argue that critical minerals discourse is inherently susceptible to co-optation toward diffuse agendas, including agendas indifferent, if not hostile, to the environmental objective of reducing carbon emissions. To continue the Australian example, despite the association of critical minerals policy with net zero emissions targets, the federal government has notoriously continued to approve new coal and gas developments. On to the third tendency. In terms of knowledge production, critical minerals discourse remystifies the economics of market projection on the one hand and the predictability of state intervention in markets on the other. In each of the periods covered, criticality assessment has bloomed as a subfield of academic knowledge. In the current third wave, criticality analysis has exploded as an interdisciplinary subfield that pulls in knowledge, data, and research funding from commercial, state, and academic sources. including geological surveying, financial markets, engineering, international relations, and economics and anthropology. There are more, obviously. In this context, to echo Rana and Heath's argument about epistemic authority, the market projections that gain the most authority, which in this third wave have been those by the International Energy Agency and the World Bank, are treated by governments and investors alike as objective truth. This is despite the fact that the methodological bases for market projection have long been criticised as inherently unreliable, not least because such projections have direct impacts on the markets they purport to predict. On to the fourth and final observation. In rebranding mining as climate action, the third wave of critical minerals discourse has leveraged the urgency of the climate crisis in favour of elite and extractive interests and away from, if not actively against, local communities and ecosystems. This is only to repeat what a diverse groundswell of scholars and activists across the global south and north have been warning for decades about disaster capitalism in general, and specifically about the risks posed by critical minerals extraction to local ecosystems and communities. Critiques of the injustice of the green transition build on older materialist critiques of extractive industry and more broadly of colonialism and imperialism that have long laid bare the basic structure of the global economy. Local communities and ecosystems, concentrated mostly but not exclusively in the global south, are exploited beyond repair in the interests of capital accumulation, concentrated mostly but not exclusively in the global north. As Ria Frankos has observed, the mining imperative thus appears to pose a zero-sum choice between decarbonisation and the protection of ecosystems and communities. In this context, critical minerals discourse is but one dimension of the subversion of the climate agenda in the interests of capital. The risks posed to local communities and ecosystems by critical minerals discourse and its elevation of elite security claims over others is worsened by the fact that the global distribution of known critical minerals deposits and projects is heavily concentrated on land over which Indigenous people exercise some form of right. According to a resource study by Owen and others, around 54% of critical minerals projects are located on Indigenous land, with a further 33% located on or near the land of peasant communities. So I'll wrap things up kind of unsatisfactorily, but to conclude that the third wave of critical minerals discourse has allowed extractive industry to so effectively deploy the rhetoric of climate action in favour of elite security interests and against local ecosystems and marginalised communities is one more illustration of the monumental challenge for progressive political movements in the current moment. It remains to be seen whether the third wave of critical minerals discourse comes to an end with the second Trump administration. I don't think it will. I think that critical minerals discourse is readily amenable to Trump's agenda. He has, in the rush of executive orders that he signed at the inauguration and with the declaration of an energy emergency, the definition of energy and resource includes critical minerals. And we've obviously seen the territorial aggression and bargaining that the Trump administration has been advancing towards both Greenland and Ukraine, and critical minerals has been playing out in both of those contexts. As such, the future of critical minerals discourse, and this is my best attempt at a conclusion, but I'm very happy to discuss with you all your views. The future of critical minerals discourse likely depends in large part on what the US's major allies, the EU, the UK, Canada, Australia, well, less so Canada, Australia, India, and Japan among them, do over the next few years with the rush of critical minerals branded alliances and policies that they've entered into over the last 4 or 5 years. And more specifically, the future of critical minerals discourse depends on whether, despite Trump's agenda, the US's major allies continue to locate their national security in alliance with the US and not in the defence of international institutions or the pursuit of multilateral action on climate change. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.